Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Avast Hacker Archives. We try to explore the aha moments that hackers and security researchers have had throughout their career, and today's very special guest is none other than Phil Zimmermann. He's the creator of, most notably, things like PGP, but also the starter of so many things that have given us secure communication over the years, like Blackphone, Silent Circle, and is still busy with looking at issues that affect surveillance, cryptography, and our ability to have secure communications. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, Phil, let's start talking about, where you got started. Let's start with Camden, New Jersey, and, what brought you across your journey. You didn't suddenly wake up and say, I know what I'm going to do. So how did that happen?
Well, I only stayed in Camden for about 15 minutes after I was born. So I grew up in South Florida. I've been interested in cryptography all my life, since I was about maybe 10. And so it wasn't a career path. It was simply a hobby. A lot of kids are kind of, they like that as a hobby. It's kind of like having an astronomy hobby when you're a kid. When I got to the university, I started playing around with computers. That was in the 70s, so we didn't have computers of our own. And we had to use a big mainframe. And so I wrote some simple encryption software at that time, which was, pretty horrible by today's standards. And then many years later, like a couple of decades later, I switched to cryptography as a career path. I spent a lot of time.
How old were you then?
I have to recompute my age each time. Let's see. I'm 67 now. So what age would I have been in? It was in the late 80s when I started to seriously try to develop my crypto skills to try to make a living. I mean, there was very little cryptography as things that ordinary people could use, and what little there was not strong. You couldn't use it in a practical sense to communicate securely. So I wanted to make something. I was a political activist at the time. In the 1980s, I was in the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, and I'd done some other kind of human rights activism. And I wanted to make something that the human rights community could use. And they're always in an adversarial relationship with some government. Mm-hmm. And so governments, have much more resources for doing cryptanalysis. And even if it's a small country, a banana republic somewhere with horrible human rights, during the Cold War, they were always client states of either the Soviets or the Americans. And so their cryptanalytic resources were available to attack communications of human rights workers. So I wanted to make something that they could use. And that's how PGP came about. PGP was originally designed for withstanding the attacks of nation states. In the business world, there was no strong need for strong cryptography because businesses pretty much were mainly interested, if they were going to use any cryptography, they were just trying to protect themselves from their competitors. And their competitors, other businesses, didn't have any significant cryptanalytic capabilities. So there was no need for strong encryption for businesses at that time. But for human rights applications, the presumed opponent is a nation state. And so there is a stronger need for strong cryptography for human rights applications. And that was the driving force in PGP.
Yeah. And I've known you for longer. You've been very passionate about having this. It's not just about email communications be secured. When we met, you were trying to develop a physical device, to have secure voice communications as well. So maybe you want to talk about what actually propelled you, why you thought that voice was a problem initially that we needed to fix so quickly. And this was already in the 90s. Yeah.
Well, I was more interested in voice than email. It's just that I was forced to try to deal with, email security first, because the enabling technology for voice, secure voice, wasn't there. There were no telephony standards. There were no VoIP standards. SIP was not invented yet. RTP, real-time protocol, was not. I don't think it was defined yet. So the surrounding technology, enabling technologies, just weren't there for secure VoIP. But email was kind of the low-hanging fruit. And so PGP was, my first attempt to do something useful for secure communication, just because email was the only thing I had access to.
And so you didn't do this from your job, right? I mean, you did PGP because you thought that you needed to build something to fix this particular problem. I mean, I think people always have this impression that you're like a gajillionaire because you invented PGP and everybody uses it. So, like, how did how did that go?
Well, I wish everyone did use it, but unfortunately, it didn't catch on to it never got widely used. I did it as a hobby, and so I had to do it in my spare time. I had a day job as an engineer. I did consulting work, and so I worked on PGP in my spare time. And in fact, I had to put my consulting work on hold because PGP became sort of completely absorbing of all my time. Young engineers are pathological optimists when it comes to estimating the time required to finish a project. So, I didn't know it was going to take that long. So I missed 5 mortgage payments.
Oh, Phil. Oh.
But but then I got it out, version 1. It didn't have all the things I wanted because, I couldn't go for 6 skipped mortgage payments.
Yeah.
And so I put it out there, and people just got all excited about it. And I thought I could just get back to my day job and focus on that and just let it sort of be out there. Mm-hmm. But the demand for everybody's sort of enthusiastic hunger for this kind of technology, they really started demanding my time. So I had to put my attention back on it and make more improvements. And so like 15 months later, I did another version which had the all singing, all dancing one. The first one that I put out had not very good cryptography, because at that time I had the delusion that I could design my own encryption algorithm. And so I found out by going to...
Let's talk about that, though, for a second.
Yeah.
There's a lot of folks that still, think that they can do their own encryption algorithm. So maybe, yeah.
I just tried to write some software that I thought would really badly scramble something so that nobody could possibly unscramble it. That seemed like the right thing to do. And cryptography is the product of an arms race. There has been for many centuries, an arms race between cryptographers and cryptanalysts. The cryptographers make, an algorithm. The cryptanalysts break it. The cryptographers improve their algorithm. The cryptanalysts improve their cryptanalytic techniques and break it again. And it goes on and on for centuries. And that's what's been driving, the art of cryptography. If you've been reading all about each step of the arms race and you're keeping up with it, you're in a better position to try to do something that's at the current position of that arms race. But if you instead don't read the literature, if you're a software engineer, and if you're a good software engineer, you develop the delusion that you can do good cryptography because it's just writing software, right? And I was a pretty good software engineer, and so I imagined that I could do good cryptography, and I was just embarrassingly wrong. I just worked on my own algorithm, and then I went to then I released that as PGP version 1. Mm-hmm. The first algorithm I did, I called it Bassomatic because named after a Saturday Night Live skit involving a blender and a fish because it scrambles your data. And And so I went to a conference, a crypto conference of professional cryptographers, academic cryptographers. And that was the first time I, went to a conference like that. And I showed it to somebody who had spent years in academia breaking things. It was Ellie Beam, who was a PhD student for Adi Shamir at the time. And he looked at it and he very quickly broke it. And so I was kind of embarrassed by that. So I then took another algorithm that was in the academic literature that had been extensively peer reviewed, and I used that instead. And so that's what I used in version 2 of PGP, which came out about over more than a year later, after the initial one. So I didn't know what I was doing in version 1. But later it got a lot better. By realizing that I'm not a real cryptographer, it made me a better cryptographer.
Phil, I love this story because there are so many things here for young engineers and people who are starting out in anything in IT, which is that, the first thing is that you don't necessarily know if it's going to be the best idea ever, but you still started writing it, that you did something that was not necessarily even going to generate money, but you did it because you loved it, that you didn't get it perfect on the first try, and that you knew how to find a network of folks that could help you do that incremental improvement. So I think there's already a lot of lessons here for folks, but to take it back to something that you just said, because that really struck a note, you said, it's unfortunate that it's not more successful. And, we talked about this as well years ago about, Johnny can't encrypt, and that's also been used as an excuse for stuff. So what's your thinking on that now? I mean, how do we get wider adoption?
I released PGP 1.0 in 1991. And in 1991, everyone was a power user. The only people that used email in 1991 were people that knew what they were doing. Using PGP at that time was cognitively within reach of most of the people that would be, using email at that time. But as the years went by and the population of email users exploded, it became there were more and more people that were not power users that were using email because email grew into that population. And so the cognitive burden of the PGP trust model in particular was too difficult for most people, non-power users to get comfortable with. And so that's why PGP did not become as widely used as WhatsApp. But there was another email encryption protocol at the time of the first version of PGP called Privacy Enhanced Mail, or PEM, and PGP absolutely crushed PEM. It completely obliterated it. And so the activation energy for PEM was higher than PGP. You had to set up a public key infrastructure in advance before you could use it. And so that was too much. And then later they tried again to do something called MOS, which also died before it could get off the ground because of PGP. And then later S-MIME came along. But it too required setting up a public key infrastructure before you could even get started. So the activation energy was a step function. Mm-hmm. It was too difficult for most people. So PGP still remained the most widely used email encryption software in the world. But still, it means that, to try to explain to your mom how to use PGP is not, it's too hard. What is a trust model? What does it mean to have, how do you get someone's public key and how do you know it's really the right public key? You need to get somebody to introduce you to that public key, a trusted introducer. Well, what does that mean? That's the whole complexity of public key infrastructures.
Yeah.
And so that just became, a cognitive burden that held back PGP. But then here we are 30 years later, and now there are more secure ways to communicate that don't involve setting up public key infrastructures. I mean, we have protocols that for VoIP. I have a great VoIP protocol called ZRTP. Mm-hmm. It doesn't require public key infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Also, text messaging, the Signal protocol is really good for that. There are several products that use the Signal protocol, including, well, I used it myself in Silent Phone. Silent Phone is a product of Silent Circle, a company that I founded a few years ago. That's actually easier. There's less cognitive burden to use protocols like that, and so it's possible for ordinary people to use secure communications. I stopped using PGP because it didn't run on my iPhone. And so I did the bulk of my email processing every day with my iPhone. And so if it didn't run on the platform I carried around with me all the time, I stopped using it.
This is going to still come as a shock, I'm sure, to a lot of diehard PGP users. But to say about like the common people not readily having or being able to use public key infrastructure, it's actually always a remarkable thing to me that we kind of have to have such an infrastructure that supports certificates that we use every day just on the web. And that it's still a lot of baggage, even for developers, to understand how to do appropriate, proper certificate management, and like just managing key information and handling their certificates and that they don't age. I mean, do you have any views on how we need to do that better?
Yeah, it's funny how when I first read about public key cryptography in the 70s, I saw the two seminal papers on the subject, New Directions in Cryptography by Diffie and Hellman, and also the RSA paper. And these two papers came out very close together in the 70s. And when I read these, I thought, oh, great, this is solving the problem of how do you get Alice and Bob to have the same key at both ends of the wire. You don't have to send a courier with a suitcase handcuffed to his wrist, carrying key material. That's a breakthrough. That's a godsend. But I thought that would, eliminate that complexity. But wait, not so fast. There's still complexity there because, okay, now you can have a public key that, you didn't have to carry by a briefcase handcuffed to somebody's wrist. But you have to know, well, which public key do you use? Do you download it from a key server? Well, are you sure it's the right one? I mean, one of the funny things that happened with PGP is, we had these key servers, which were a little more than just public databases that people could upload their public key to. Mm-hmm. The problem is that people would upload keys, that weren't the right keys for the names that they put on them. Somebody would install PGP, and as a joke, the first thing that happens when you run PGP, it asks you for your name and email address. And so you put your name and email address, and it generates a key pair, and it says, here you are. Now you can upload it to a server. Well, people would put my name instead of their name. Yeah. and my email address instead of their email address. And then they would upload that to the server. So the early servers were pretty stupid. And so the early servers had 10 keys that all had my name on it, and only one of them was mine. And so I would get these encrypted emails from people that used one of the other 9 keys, and I couldn't decrypt it. And so, that's kind of the mess of, how do you know you're getting the right public key? I mean, these were not intel agencies trying to attack me with a man-in-the-middle attack. These were just, people that wanted to vandalize, the key server. And so, how do you know you're getting the right public key? Well, there's a lot of complexity in that. And that's why you have certificate authorities. In the case of PGP, instead of a centralized trust model with a centralized certificate authority, you have a decentralized trust model where people can just sign other people's keys and thereby introduce it to others. And then you download a public key from the server, and it's got, 20 signatures on it. And maybe you'll recognize one of those 20 people that signed it, and even though you don't know the other 19 people. And thereby you'll know that the key is legitimate because someone that you trust vouched for it. So that was the PGP trust model. But, there's complexity in that too. What you still have to know you have to authenticate whoever's going to sign keys.
It's actually really funny, Phil, because recently we did have an enormous uptake for people who didn't necessarily know what the security behind it was, but suddenly saw from their WhatsApp screen like a request to accept new terms and conditions, and people started paying attention, and they kind of in one go massively migrated over to Signal. And Signal saw a rush of new users because WhatsApp decided to update their terms of service to say that they're going to do more with Facebook than ever before. And it created basically a volume of Signal users. And again, these are not security people necessarily, but these are people that have particular feelings about their privacy and definitely very particular feelings about Facebook. Do you think that, having different type of signals or impetuses towards driving people toward a more secure model is going to work for the future?
Well, the big problem with WhatsApp is that they were owned by Facebook, and Facebook is in the metadata business. So even though the underlying protocol for key exchange is a good protocol, it's the Signal protocol in WhatsApp, it still leaks a lot of information. The metadata, who are you calling? How long did you speak with them? What's the timestamp on the call? It uploads your address book to Facebook servers. Mm-hmm. It doesn't try to anonymize your address book. No, they just steal your whole address book, everything in your address book, every real name and phone number and email address and everything. And then they cross correlate that with everything. They build up a dossier on everybody, mm-hmm. Even people that you call that aren't on Facebook. That's quite disturbing. If you're trying to set up secure communications with somebody, you don't want Facebook to know all about it. And that's why there was a mass migration to Signal. Signal doesn't keep all that. And, my company, Silent Circle, also didn't keep anything. We didn't keep logs of anything. And mm-hmm. Signal doesn't keep logs of anything consequential either. There's more to privacy than simply how you exchange the keys on the channel.
And what would your take be towards, new or competitors to Signal or to any of these? Would you still want to do this kind of stuff again?
Well, I had a lot of fun doing secure VoIP. It's something that I was interested in even before I did PGP. In fact, before I did PGP, I did do a rudimentary secure telephony application with a friend of mine who had done some kind of prototype thing, and it didn't get anywhere. But then I did PGP, and so I always wanted to get back to secure VoIP. And I did. In 1995. I did PGP Phone, which was a secure VoIP product. But it was too early. Nobody had broadband, and without broadband, it's hard to do good VoIP. I wanted to do it, and I did. I did several of these secure VoIP implementations, and the most recent being from Silent Circle with our Silent Phone app. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, the nice thing about it at that time is that it wasn't a crowded field. There weren't many competitors when I started. But now there are. There's a lot of, secure VoIP products out there. It would not be a good idea to do it again at this mm-hmm. point because its market is saturated.
Mm-hmm. So, Phil, we saw a whole bunch of people starting to take note of having communication secrecy when we saw them migrate off of WhatsApp and go towards Signal because of the change of the terms of service of WhatsApp. What's your view on that?
I was kind of envious of how WhatsApp achieved instant overnight network effect because the product didn't have any encryption for a long time. And so it collected, a billion users without any encryption. And then they made a deal with Signal to install the Signal protocol. And overnight, a billion users suddenly had end-to-end encryption, in a single. They pushed out an update, and then instantly the entire population is doing secure communications. It was incredible. You have to go for network effect before anything else. And if you do that, then you could encrypt it later. I mean, or you could encrypt it from the start, but you've got to achieve network effect. It's all important. But people migrated from WhatsApp to Signal because WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, and Facebook is in the metadata business. And WhatsApp started collecting a lot more metadata and sending it to Facebook. And that means that even though you have an end-to-end secure channel for talking or texting with someone, the metadata is still being collected. In other words, Facebook is logging who you're talking to, how long did you talk with them. It also has a dossier on that person, and a dossier on you. And so it's matching up these two giant dossiers that it has about you, including all of your Facebook postings and everything. I'm not on Facebook.
Facebook activity, right? I mean, because there's
I think social networks and Facebook especially have done a great deal of harm to the world. They might be fun for a lot of things, but they come at a steep price. And if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. They collect all this metadata, and that means that WhatsApp users, in an attempt to get secure communications, are bleeding so much information that's permanently logged that they really don't have much privacy. When Facebook acquired WhatsApp, they paid a lot of money for it, and there was a period of time where they weren't collecting so much metadata, but then they transitioned to collecting as much as possible, and that's what triggered the migration.
Yeah, and I think in a way it's not all hunky-dory, because there's also initiatives now that are also very often focused on stuff like WhatsApp. So you might have heard of something called the Ghost Protocol that was suggested a while ago to actually had another party to a communications channel without the current parties that were in it knowing about it, and just getting basically a BCC of all the communications that was happening. And there's also now a lots of push, not just in the US, but also in Europe, to have additional surveillance capabilities. We're trying to couch this in the language of we need to strike a balance between security and privacy.
Yeah. Whenever they say strike a balance, you should immediately get suspicious.
Yeah.
When they say that, it's kind of like when someone says, "With all due respect," that they're about to say something very offensive,
horrible.
Right? Yeah. They're about to say something that has no respect, right? With all due respect. So well, we have to strike a balance. Well, no, that means it means the opposite. Nobody's going to strike any balances here. They're going to just absolutely destroy your privacy.
So what do you see happening? What do you think people should be doing, or precaution-wise? What should we? Yeah,
we have to push back in policy space. We did this debate in the 1990s. We pretty much spent the entire decade of the 1990s debating whether people should be able to use strong cryptography, and it was a debate that had the participation of all relevant sectors of society. The legislative arm, the law enforcement, intel agencies, journalists, human rights workers, academia. Everybody was involved in that debate. And throughout the whole 90s, we reached a near consensus. I say near, but the near consensus was that it's better to have strong encryption. And the only holdout was the FBI. They never let go. They never changed their position. But all the rest of the community, all the rest of human civilization, decided that it was a good idea to have strong encryption. And so, and we wouldn't have e-commerce today without strong encryption. We wouldn't have online banking. It reminds me probably about 15 years ago, maybe more. I was in Colombia to give a talk at a conference. While I was there, they asked me if I could meet with a member of the Colombian parliament, because Colombia was at that time considering a new law that would enable banks to use strong encryption. Not even banks. The laws in Colombia at that time said nobody's allowed to use strong encryption. Not even banks. And and so the banks were getting robbed. Criminals would break into the banks, hack into them, and just steal lots and lots of money, and nobody could stop them because there was no strong encryption. And so we're preparing for this meeting to meet with a member of parliament to explain why such a law was a good idea. And somebody came to the meeting and apologized for being late because her bank account had been cleaned out by criminals that very morning. And so what an irony. We're there to, plan our meeting with the member of parliament to enact a new law that protects banks with strong encryption, and somebody's late to the meeting because they got robbed because of the absence of such a law. Well, I'm pretty sure that they straightened that out many years ago. So that was good for the banks. But the rest of society needed it too. We live in a world today where strong encryption is an enabling technology for so many different parts of our lives. And now the threat model on the internet is so bad. There's organized crime, and there's hostile foreign powers, nation states trying to get in and do. I mean, this recent ransomware attack on a pipeline was driven by Russian mafia that had been approved by Putin, or at least that's what it looks like. And so we need to have strong encryption to protect every part of our of society. We needed to protect industry. We needed to protect e-commerce. We needed to protect individuals. We needed to protect the police and to protect SEAL Team 6,
But again, this is the same argument, Phil. So the same folks are saying, look, if you didn't have this cryptography that no one could break, then you wouldn't have this ransomware that's capable of encrypting something so much that we would have to only negotiate with these criminals in order to get a decryption key back from them.
No, the criminals would just attack differently. They wouldn't just encrypt things,
We're preaching to the choir, but my point is that it's the argument that's being proposed exactly in that recent ransomware case. This is exactly the reason why they feel that, and it's just a slippery slope from saying what kind of cryptography should be okay and which shouldn't be okay.
The biggest thing that triggers them right now is end-to-end encryption. It's not just encryption. I mean, if you do e-commerce, it's not really end-to-end. It's client to server, But end-to-end is what really sets off law enforcement. They don't want people to have end-to-end encryption. But I'd like to point out that right now we're seeing extensive deployment of 5G infrastructure across Europe. That's made by Huawei. And Huawei is a Chinese company that was founded by Chinese military officers and with deep ties to Chinese intelligence. And if Huawei succeeds in deploying 5G infrastructure for, all over Europe, their signals intelligence capabilities across Europe is going to be, comparable to NSA's. And if we want to protect ourselves from that kind of terrible environment, we're going to need end-to-end encryption. You can't just rely on the infrastructure to protect you. If the infrastructure is now under the control of a hostile foreign power, then you better be using end-to-end encryption. And that applies to all over society. That means private industry. That means our military and diplomatic communications. All these things rely on that infrastructure in varying degrees. But you need to have an extra layer that you are in control of, end to end. And without that, a foreign autocracy that doesn't have your best interest in mind.
I think it's probably the best argument to give to the same folks who want to decrypt it for everybody else, because this is exactly why they would want to encrypt it for themselves, because they certainly don't want.
It's a matter of national security. I mean, what sometimes happens in bureaucracies is that the people want to make their own jobs easier, possibly at the expense of other people elsewhere in the bureaucracy. So law enforcement might have a slightly easier time if we didn't have end-to-end encryption, but the other parts of national security, our intel agencies and our, special operations guys and, other in our state departments or foreign ministries are all going to suffer because law enforcement wanted to have an easier time of it. Law enforcement should step back and not just think of their own selfish needs, but think about the needs of the rest of their own government. What about law enforcement works for a government? That same government has a foreign ministry with secure communication needs. The damage done to our national security interest by not having end-to-end encryption is worse than the damage done by a few criminals that are doing end-to-end encryption. I mean, let the police use other investigative tools to try to solve crimes. And they do. I mean, they are doing that.
So I think that's really the argument. Yes to special investigatory powers, which are specific to a particular target rather than mass or unilateral surveillance or structural weakening of strong cryptography.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to something like that. I always love it when you explain it, and I would love it if you'd explain it to other folks too. We've talked about your activism around, using nuclear weapons, but we also talked sometime about nuclear energy and the use of nuclear energy and your ideas around like thorium reactors.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
I think that for climate change, we're going to have to come up with every possible idea we can come up with that doesn't involve carbon emissions. And solar energy is one of those, and wind turbines are another, are becoming more attractive because of giant battery farms, like what Tesla has done. But that's not the whole story. I mean, we should be trying to find every possible non-carbon emission energy technology that we can get our hands on, because we need to absolutely eliminate carbon emission energy sources. And so one of them, I think, has to be nuclear. It's not the whole solution, but it does, it's good for some part of the total solution. And historically, nuclear power had three big problems. There were really giant problems. One of them was the meltdowns, the Fukushima disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, 3 Mile Island. And that has to do with, how they're engineered. They have failure modes that can be quite spectacular and catastrophic. The second problem is that they produce transuranic wastes that have to be isolated from the environment for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And that's very difficult to achieve. And the third is nuclear proliferation. All of the old reactor designs involve the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle, and it produces plutonium as, every commercial nuclear reactor produces plutonium. And so if you have nuclear reactors all over the world generating electricity, they're also producing plutonium. And so it's possible to separate that plutonium out and use it to build nuclear weapons. And so those are the three big things. Nuclear accidents, meltdowns, transuranic waste that has to be isolated from the environment, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons because, it just makes lots of plutonium. So we need reactor designs that don't have those problems. And there are some. They don't produce plutonium, and they don't, you can build nuclear reactors, whether it's thorium or even the same nuclear fuel that we were using, in such a way that you don't have the meltdowns. You can, instead of having pressurized light water reactors that boil water, and it's under pressure, you can have it molten salt reactors. So you mix the fuel with a molten salt, and you don't need to keep it under pressure because the molten salt is very, very hot, and it doesn't boil so easily like water. You can have it without the pressure vessel, and the nuclear fuel could be uranium in a molten salt reactor, but it could also be plutonium. I'm sorry, I meant thorium. And thorium is widely available. I mean, you can find thorium in your backyard in tiny quantities. We can build reactors that that don't melt down, you can turn them off and go home for the weekend and come back and turn them back on again. They did that with a molten salt reactor back in the 60s as it was an experimental reactor. And if there's a power failure like there was in Fukushima, it doesn't, the tsunami came in and flooded the diesel generators in the basement, and they lost their electricity, so they couldn't keep pumping water through to cool it off.
Yeah.
So, you can avoid that. You can have, if you have a molten salt reactor, you can have the molten salt drain into a cookie sheet or a tank that's shaped the wrong way for fission. You have to get all the conditions just right to do nuclear fission. And if you drain it into a tank that has the wrong geometry, there won't be any more fission. Yeah. And so you could walk away from it. All the people in the control room could decide to go on strike and walk away.
As a fail-safe, yeah.
And they, or whatever, they become unavailable, then the reactor will shut itself down gracefully. So there are nuclear technologies. Now, I have been around a lot of anti-nuclear activists in my day. I was an anti-nuclear weapons activist, but I was also against nuclear power because of those major problems that it had. But now we have new reactor technologies that eliminate all three of those major obstacles to nuclear power. And so climate change is so devastating, it could kill hundreds of millions of people and create hundreds of millions of refugees. We have to give it a very high priority, and that means taking a fresh look at nuclear power. I think it's great to see, we're seeing a big surge in solar power and wind power, mostly because of the idea of storing it in batteries, because that was always the big objection to renewables, is that, well, the sun doesn't shine at night, or what if the wind is not blowing, then put it in batteries and, smooth it out that way. And so that's great. And also you can put solar panels on rooftops of residences. That's great too. So we should do all that. Absolutely, we should do all that. But it's not going to be enough all by itself. And so I think we should take another look at nuclear power.
Phil, I love this because I could ask you 20 different questions, which we don't have the time for, but I could ask you questions on all the other stuff. On interstellar and black holes and all kinds of stuff, which we sadly can't get all into today.
Everybody I'm typecast as Mr. PGP, I'm like Leonard Nimoy trying to get different acting jobs,
Never gonna happen. Yeah. Not for Leonard anyway, not for Leonard. But I think it's wonderful to be known for something and to have something so amazing. I mean, you're the only person I know who's in the Internet Hall of Fame. But can I say, despite all the cool stuff you've done and the awards you've won, if you had one piece of advice to the younger Phil Zimmerman, what would it be?
This is why time travel stories are so popular. I don't know. I made enough mistakes in my life that I could go back and tell myself not to make those mistakes in so many places.
It's hard to say one thing, maybe a couple of things.
I think that in my entrepreneurial activities, I think I probably would have done some things differently. Because, while I have had, I've had a big emphasis on the engineering side of tech startups, I didn't have enough business savvy. And so now I've been through enough mistakes of that I'm a little bit smarter on the business side of things than I was back then. And so I probably would have advised myself not to do certain things that, led to unsuccessful outcomes.
Well, I think we can all find something with that. I think we've all had those moments. So, Phil, if I could also ask you another question about, what's the thing, looking back, that you're also the most proud of?
Well, I think I'm going to start with an answer that I think a lot of people would say, which is my children. I've got 2 kids that I'm quite proud of. And so I think that of all the things in my life that I'm proud of, that they are at the top of that. I'm proud of my activism, that my life work was motivated by trying to do something to save the world. I was very active in the 1980s and in the peace movement. and privacy and civil liberties. And, I look back on all my activism there, and so that makes me proud. I think that in my professional life of, technology development, I had the most fun doing secure voice products. They're a lot more fun than secure email. But the secure email came first, and that was a kind of an enabling event in the world of cryptography, because it inspired a lot of other people to come into the field. And I published the source code. They downloaded the source code and studied it and decided to pursue careers in that. A lot of people have emailed me telling me that.
But where'd you have the most fun?
I think the most fun I think I had is the travel. I've been to 48 countries, and PGP was the enabling force that enabled so much travel. I hired engineers in Ukraine to work on some of my projects, so I had to go there, and I've just been all over the world, and that's a lot of fun. I'm in the Million Mile Club with United Airlines. I've been living in Europe for some years now. That's fun. It's a different perspective. It's been fun to live in a place that that I'm not embarrassed about, like I was under Trump in the U.S., watching with horror as events unfolded. I don't know. Maybe that was a rather scattered answer to your question.
No, I think it's a good answer, and I think knowing you're far from done yet, so you're still going to be doing a lot more, and that's going to be super exciting for all the rest of us. With that, Phil, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us, the Avast Hacker Archives. Stay tuned, because we're going to have more interesting episodes coming up. Thanks.